Thank you very much, Julia. It's a great pleasure to be here at Berkeley, a spiritual home of the subject in many ways. And thanks very much to you, Julia, and also to everyone else here at the University of California who have made me so welcome and invited me. I'm going to be giving a very biographical talk for you this evening, a very personal talk. And I think perhaps that is because I turned 40 this year, which is a crossroads in anyone's life. And so it's enough to make you, or at any rate has it been enough to make me think about where I've been and where I am going. So later on in the talk, I'll talk a little bit about where I'm going, but first where I've been. When I was born 40 years ago, back in '72, studio craft was at the height of its powers. And so, for example, the exhibition Objects USA, which was probably the most successful project ever done in the field, was still touring the world. It had launched in 1969, was in Europe by then. Universities were busily opening rather than closing medium-specific courses on ceramics, metal, glass, textiles, woodworking. Across the waters in my new home of Britain, there was a brand new crafts council. It had been founded in 1971, and the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I work now, was just about to open an exhibition called Craftsman's Art, which would open in 1973. Little did I know, growing up over the next few years, that I was living through a period of decline. I may have looked cheerful enough, despite the hideous prevailing fashions, exacerbated by my parents' love for hand-me-downs, perhaps, from the neighbors. But all around me, craft was acquiring a dubious double reputation for hippie idealism, on the one hand, brought to by Telegraph Avenue, and on the other hand, forthright commercialism, two countervailing tendencies to excess, neither of which would age very well. Now, that's not a story I propose to recount to you tonight, but suffice to say that the popular enthusiasm that craft had enjoyed in the 1960s and 70s did not survive the harsher climate of the 80s. In art, it was a time for theory and the anti-aesthetic, which at the time seemed antithetical to the values of craft. And meanwhile, design was embarking on the thrill ride of postmodernism, in which most of the objects were in fact handmade, like this chair designed for Memphis by Peter Shire in Los Angeles, but did nothing to celebrate the fact that they were handmade. Rather, they were calculated for the effect they'd make when mass-produced in the form of glossy magazine shots, or for that matter, in slide lecture presentations like this one. Now, I wasn't nearly hip enough to have my own postmodern turn, but I certainly did get the drift. And by the time I was 20, so 20 years ago, I had formed a firm opinion of craft as something I didn't need to take too seriously. Now, here's a little rarity. This is an interview that was taken with me and my brother in 1992 by a local access channel near Boston, where I grew up.
But I do volunteer work at the museum at Harvard for German art. And I also do some volunteer work at a crafts gallery that I've been working at since the beginning of the summer. And I also, this is interesting, I worked at a museum in Brockton, way south of Boston, the Fuller Museum. And it was really interesting to work there. They're this sort of impoverished museum with no permanent collection to speak of, no money really, and a sort of minimal staff because they can't afford to pay staff. And so they're trying to somehow get by on all these things. And it was really interesting to work there. That was the first museum I'd ever worked in. And they had so many problems. I mean, it's amazing.
I've been to that museum.
Really?
Yeah.
It's a wonderful place. It's
the facility in the building and
wonderful.
The land surrounding it, it is.
But they have almost nothing to put in it.
Exactly.
You know? And
it's almost like, at least my first impression was it was almost like a craft show.
I think the reason that they do that is because you can easily arrange a craft show, and it's cheap, and you don't have to pay the artist for the right to hang the pictures on the wall. Whereas if you're hanging really important art, you have to actually get the art from the artist. Whereas a craft show, you can just use any local craft, not any, but you know. And actually, I'm going to be hopefully helping arrange a glass craft exhibit there next summer. So I don't know if that'll pan out or not, but I know they're doing one. So it's going to be a crafts fair again. But you know, it's interesting. I think that usually museums aren't very crafts oriented.
No.
And it's not, I don't think necessarily a bad thing when they are, because you have huge museums like the Museum of Fine Arts or Metropolitan in New York, and there's so much art in those museums that that they're not going to be showing a lot of crafts, so you might as well, in the other museums, you might as well show something else.
So little did I know then that the Fuller Museum, that impoverished museum, designed by I.M. Pei, that I said was kind of nice, would in fact become a craft museum full-time in due course, or much less that I would be very pleased to hear that it became a craft museum. Or indeed that I would eventually go on to work in a craft store in Brooklyn, sporting a short-lived and possibly ill-advised beard, and then to graduate school, where I started studying the subject in earnest, going so far as to try my hands at various crafts, as you can see here. Less and less hair all the time, you'll notice. But let me go back just a couple of years earlier, to 1990, the same year that interview was taken. As you can tell, I had no notion then that I was going to become a specialist in this subject, but that was about to change, thanks in part to this dish. As an undergraduate, I decided to take a course on the history of Chinese ceramics, not for any particularly good reason. As I remember, it was because I was commuting to campus and just wanted to fit my courses into as tight a schedule as possible. Professor Maury's history of Chinese pottery and porcelain happened to fit between two courses I did want to take, which I've now forgotten. So I signed up for the Chinese ceramics course, and in fact, I was one of the only people there, because other students perhaps lacked my peculiar motivation to study this esoteric subject. So there were only about 12 of us seated around a seminar table on a Tuesday morning for handling sessions. And so there I was, sitting in this quiet room with this older professor with a white mustache, holding a Tang Dynasty dish that was about a millennium old. To be honest, I don't recall the specifics of the session, what I was supposed to be learning, apart from a bit of technical information about the colors. So for example, the cobalt blue, the iron brown, the red green, remember that? And I also remember some facts about the impact of the Silk Road trade on wares like this, which often emulate metalwork from the Near East. But what's really stayed with me is not these trivia, but rather the physical force of the thing that was in my hands. Its age, its delicacy, its sheer alienness hit me like a ton of bricks, as did the electric sense of connection to a remote time, place, and unknown person, what the potter Edmund Duval has called the synapse that connects one hand to another across the centuries. There was no comparison to the other art historical experiences I've had, sitting in darkened lecture halls like this one, watching the slides flick by. The dish was there, it was palpable in my hands. No amount of talking about it seemed to use it up, or even to approach an adequate explanation of it. So partly it seemed like it was a difficult thing to talk about, do justice to, and my career has been since, in some ways, an attempt to live up to that moment of attraction, and also maybe in some ways an attempt to get over it, or at least to put it into some kind of context. My book, Thinking Through Craft, for example, which I published in 2007, does have a few asides about the pleasures of pots and other skillfully made things. For example, in the conclusion, I mentioned how important it was to me that I could sit in this chair made by furniture maker Art Carpenter here from the Bay Area. Now sadly passed away, but I knew him well and talked to him a lot about this chair that I was lucky enough to own, a chair from 1969. And I talked about how important it was for me to compose the book sitting in this artifact. But for the most part, Thinking Through Craft treats its declared subject as an intellectual chess piece in the big game of art, showing how artists have used craft as a horizon against which they could define their own higher ambitions. It is definitely a book written by someone who had given that interview back in 1992, in the sense that I still then thought that craft was a subordinate term, inevitably, is destined to remain so. How else would I have come around to the key argument that craft's inferiority is the most productive thing about it? Now, when making this case, I perhaps drew again on my childhood. Not any particular experience I'd had of craft back then, because although I made the odd Christmas ornament at school, this present from my parents, I think, being my earliest extant effort in this field. I was 5 when I made this. my house was not really a craft zone. It was kind of an all Tupperware household. But I do think of certain values that were instilled in me back then, certainly by my parents, but also by the media that I was watching. For example, by the Charlie Brown Christmas special, based on Charles Schulz's beloved Peanuts characters. It first aired on television in 1965, but it was still in annual repeats during the holiday season when I was growing up, and December never passed without me sitting down to watch it again. I hope you know the show and the story. If not, I do recommend it, but I'll give you a quick summary. Charlie Brown is hired on as the director of the school holiday pageant, and he proves to be absolutely useless at this, possibly because the other children are unswervingly devoted to new wave dance. So the kids send him off to get them a tree to put on stage. A big shiny aluminum Christmas tree, they tell him. Do something right for a change. But when he and his friend Linus get to the tree farm with its bright lights and neon colors, it's not one of the garish new Tannenbaums that speaks to him, but rather a spindly little pine with a few pathetic bristles of needles. I think it needs me, he says to Linus. We might well speculate on Charlie Brown's psychological motivations at this juncture, but let's just say that when he returns to show the other children the humble tree that he's found, he is roundly mocked. He is anguished. He exits stage left, cloaked in shame. But then Linus delivers a speech about the true meaning of Christmas. And the other children, newly infused with the spirit of the holiday, gather round. In a single magical moment of tree trimming, the sad little stick becomes lush, green, and resplendent. Charlie Brown returns. He is stunned by the transformation, and the other children wish him a Merry Christmas and break into song as the credits roll. In this little story, I find an allegory of how I, and I suspect a lot of other people in this room, feel about craft. When we started caring about it, we thought it needed us. Back in the 90s, craft seemed a neglected object, underloved, languishing in the corner of our various disciplines of art, design, and art history, outdone by bigger, shinier things. Now, we've woken up to a surprising reality. Craft has become, as Schulz might have put it back in the 1960s, real in. The transformation has been exciting, but also disorienting, especially if, like me, you were originally motivated by a sense of injustice, a sense of cause. When knitters and potters and weavers were treated as second-class citizens, their work lay beneath the notice of the art and design world. And the makers themselves were often dismissed as either hippie throwbacks or wannabe real artists. And it made sense to champion them. Now we face a different set of questions about the appropriateness of appropriating craft skills like this in a department store, often in a manner, of course, that radically decontextualizes them or flattens them. Or conversely, about the merits of work that claims the values of care and authentic expression that we associate with craft, but none of its technical excellence. A trend that I've described as sloppy craft, borrowing a phrase coined by Josh Fott, here in the second row, and Ann Wilson, who was his instructor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And here I'm using not Josh's work, but the ceramics of Arlene Shechet as an exemplar. So these are very interesting questions about the fashionability of craft in these other guises as a commercial idiom or as an artistic idiom. And they become more interesting and more pressing when craft is receiving so much attention from so many quarters, from so many institutions. So here, for example, the show Dirt on Delight at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. You see more of Shechet's work here in the foreground, in this groundbreaking show on ceramics that I was lucky enough to work on. Or designers who are, for example, retreating to the woods in rural England to commune with pole lathe turners, traditional craftspeople, and then exhibiting the results of their labors at the Milan Furniture Fair. This is an example by the designer Gareth Neal. When corporations use the rhetoric of craft to sell everything from shoes to sandwiches to makeup to Jeep Wagoneers. When my own museum, the V&A, finally gets around to showing another exhibition celebrating craft. The last one you'll remember was in 1973. This one called Power of Making is the second most popular show we've had in recent memory. 315,000 people came to see it. And it's still kind of cascading through the institution as an echo and example of what we should be doing. There's also attention from political quarter. So for example, this pinstripe politician, whose name is John Hayes, and is a Tory minister, no less, so basically the equivalent to a cultural minister, or cultural secretary, I should say, for the Republican Party, appropriates the language of the dyed-in-the-wool socialist William Morris.
You know, practical skills matter. They matter to our economy, where shortages of craft skills, of technical skills, will hold back our businesses unless we address them. They matter to individuals, those individuals whose aptitudes, whose tastes and talents take them down the vocational route, the practical route, rather than the academic one. And they matter to communities too. All communities need that variety of talents, that variety of skills, which people who have pursued a vocational route and then achieve the best they can be, bring.
So, sorry, that seems to cut out a little before the end, but you can see there that he's presenting what I would regard as a kind of traditional right-wing class structure in the guise of a sort of positive message about craft. So he's appropriating, as I say, William Morris-style language in order precisely to try to divide craft from what he's describing as intellectual work. Very interesting and possibly disturbing development over on my side of the ocean. But more broadly, there is this celebratory spirit and feeling about craft at the moment in the mass media, and this is clearly why the political class has been turning to it. And again, I can speak from direct experience of being on television, having been put in front of the cameras again, this time as a judge on, I guess you would call it a reality TV show, entitled Paul Martin's Handmade Revolution. The program was shot this summer and just aired earlier this month, and it has a simple premise. Amateur craftspeople bring in an object they have made to be assessed by a panel of experts. My job as head judge was to lead a panel of three alongside Piyush, a sharp-tongued textile entrepreneur who is sort of our answer to Simon Cowell, as you could say, and Mary Jane, who is a sweet-tempered milliner, ever ready with a helpful suggestion for improvement. The job of the presenter, Paul Martin, was to emit boundless enthusiasm, as far as I could make out. Looking up into the sky as the camera swooped above him, he praised the handmade as an antidote to the deadness of mass production and exhorted the audience to discover traditional skills before they disappeared forever. And here I'm going to give you a little bit of a rarity. This is a video that I shot on the set with my iPhone. I hope you can make out the sound. But this is him filming the sort of intro to the show, but from the side, and I think it's quite interesting to see the TV being made from a different angle from the one it's intended to be seen from.
And action.
We're living in a disposable culture where we buy, use and bin virtually everything. And to quote Oscar Wilde, we know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Another prominent Victorian, William Morris, urged us to have nothing in our homes that we do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. And like him, I want to champion Britain's heritage. So come on, join me, Paul Martin, in my handmade revolution.
Yay! I think you could hear the name dropping there. And so for a historian like myself, participating in the show was an oddly familiar but also a very curious experience. So, for example, the show conforms in its atmosphere, generally speaking, to the broad outlines of a contemporary reality TV show, as I said, but despite the incendiary turn in revolution in the title, it's a very gentle, almost entirely apolitical affair. And it reminds me of the puzzlingly harmless phenomenon of guerrilla knitting, which in a way, you can imagine if you're worried about revolutionaries out on the streets, you can't think of anything better they could be doing than knitting. So very kind of unthreatening atmosphere on the show, light and joyful, focusing on personal development rather than social change. All the finalists, regardless of skill level, are congratulated for their dedication and their passion, which is a word that's used a lot on the program, meaning not entirely clear. And the message is very much that craft is a non-competitive activity. This is perhaps most explicitly telegraphed by the fact that there are no winners on the show, only judges' favorites. Can't be a bad craftsperson. Yet despite this fundamentally life-affirming core message, the program is staged against a rhetorical backdrop of cultural crisis. So Paul Martin's introduction had many historical echoes ranging from Oscar Wilde to Walter Gropius's proclamation in the Bauhaus Manifesto, which you'll remember says, "Architects and designers, we must all return to the crafts," or of course the writings of William Morris. And you could go back further, seeking precedents for the show, to John Ruskin's Unto This Last, Henry David Thoreau's Walden, or Thomas Carlyle's Sign of the Times, all of which outline the need for a reinvestment in craft and self-sufficiency in order to counter the dehumanizing effects of industry. So despite this, as I say, very positive overall atmosphere, there's an underlying fretful worry about craft disappearing forever, and the show has come to save it. That's very much the message. Paul Martin on his white horse. Now, in my next book, which is called The Invention of Craft, as Julia kindly mentioned in February, I track the idea that craft is disappearing. I track the idea that craft is disappearing, and try to show just how old a tradition that idea is. In fact, I have come to the conclusion that craft, in its modern sense, was invented as a point of departure, an old thing passing inevitably into history, against which new things, industry chiefly, could define themselves. Until that oppositional structure came about, there, in a sense, was no craft, at least not in our sense, not as in the sense of a defined territory. After all, the only way to make anything, pretty much, was by hand. So what would you define craft against? It had no territory because it was production in a completely differentiated way. And this brings me at last to my real theme today, which is that of a long goodbye. So far in my lecture, I have been tracing an autobiographical passage from certainty to uncertainty, from the pleasures of the single object, that tongue dish that I showed you, to the forbidding complexities of post-disciplinarity and the strangeness of the mediated condition. I have used my own experience as a representative example of this shift, but I'm pretty sure it's not just me. I'm sure many of you can tell similar stories, and as I know from editing this journal, together with Tanya Harrod and Ned Cook, it also has been a real trend in scholarship around this subject. Some of you in the room have contributed to its pages. For example, Julia's wonderful essay on Harmony Hammond. We've had Alison Smith, who's also here profiled in the pages just as examples. And I've learned a huge amount from all of this. It's been, I would say, the best education I've ever had. It was not going to graduate school, but rather editing colleagues' works in this journal. And it would really be impossible to summarize the contents of the past 5 years, a plethora of arguments, theories, and case studies. But if I were to generalize, I would say that our authors tend to seek out craft where you wouldn't necessarily expect to find it, and also almost always feel obliged to cast doubt on craft's seeming authenticity. These instincts play out in many different geographical and chronological situations, but two of my favorite recent articles have looked at New York City in the 1930s, finding there an unexpected vogue for craft as a technique of persuasion. Ezra Shales, now at Mass Art, examined the Empire State Building as a handmade object. He points out that the skyscraper was assembled and finished almost entirely by artisans, hundreds of skilled specialist craftsmen. And moreover, these workers were not ignored, but on the contrary, celebrated at the time, even used to make political points by Alfred E. Smith, then governor of New York, and as he never tired of reminding prospective voters, a former bricklayer. And he was instrumental in holding up the Empire State Building as an example of fine workmanship. Also, he was, I think, hoping to position himself advantageously in relation to labor politics at the time. Across town in New York, at the same time, the Natural History Museum was launching its own press campaign, promoting itself through equally fascinating images of craft in action. Victoria Kane, a scholar at NYU, discusses this in her article for our journal, which takes as its primary evidence photographs of the preparators who made the famous natural history dioramas at the museum, here a Triceratops. These images projected an image of scientific but also artisanal know-how. In this case, it was the spectacle of inauthenticity that made such good theater of craft. Now, neither the Empire State Building nor a natural history diorama conform to usual expectations of what we mean when we say modern craft, but it seems to me that such case studies absolutely fit the bill and broaden, very usefully, our conception of how craft operates in the culture. Craft seems to retain its rhetorical power no matter what the location, despite its reputation for traditionalism. In fact, it's constantly shifting. So articles like these, and many others in the journal, chart an expanded field of craft in which it is manifestly not inferior, not necessarily artistic either, but rather it's a simple fact of modern life. And you could say that this is the real story of the 20th century and one that's just beginning to be told. As the caption here puts it, again, an image from Ezra Shell's article on the Empire State Building, and I hope you can see it says, "The artisans are dead," but underneath it says, "But here are the new artisans." They're on building sites and in industry, making prototypes. They're in the preparatory stages of medicine, making tools. They're in design, they're in engineering, they're in a host of other disciplines as well. And ironically, these are the areas where organizations like the American Crafts Council have made very few alliances in the 20th century. Why? Well, industrial artisans like these, they considered to be alienated, lacking in individual freedom or expressive opportunity. Amateurs, they saw it quite simply as beneath them, trapped in their obsessions, and again, lacking in artistic merit. Craftspeople working across the world for tourist markets, they saw as purveyors of inauthentic kitsch, sunk in a parody of their own traditions. The luxury industry, which is in fact one of the greatest repositories of high levels of craft skill in the world, the studio movement saw as aesthetically and possibly morally bankrupt, which is an opinion that many of you indeed may share. The hidden engine room of the art world, the fabrication shop, was meanwhile to them simply offstage and inaccessible. Skilled fabricators created the minimalist and pop sculpture of the 60s, and today make the work of art stars like Jeff Koons, Rachel White-Reed, and Mark Quinn. But these are secretive places where a great deal of capital is concentrated in skilled hands behind closed doors. This is the real story of art in relation to craft, you might say. Not the story I told in Thinking Through Craft, but a much more direct story, craftspeople making artworks. But that fabrication business seems to be beyond the crafts world's reach. And in fact, Julia and I right now are working on a project about this, and I can say it's very, very difficult to get into this world, much less make a photograph that you can then publish. And so there are real logistical problems about trying to expose this as a history of craft. Taking such ideas seriously as modern craft, taking such areas of production seriously as modern craft has been a central goal for the journal. For me personally, editing this material has taken me way out of my comfort zone as a trained art historian. It's taken me into the terrains of anthropology, social history, and economic analysis. It seems to me that this broadening of view is the most momentous thing to happen to craft studies since I've been involved with it. It's exciting, partly because it gives us license to pursue the subject wherever it may take us, and to discover just how wide the horizons of craft are. Indeed, to wonder whether those horizons I talked about in Thinking Through Craft really exist at all, or whether they're entirely illusory. But there is also a big problem that accompanies this change in perspective. If we're now aware of the prevalence and persistence of craft in all these modern situations, then what exactly are we fighting for? What is the project? What is our project when the other kids are already singing around a tree and we discover maybe they have been for a long time? We just haven't been listening. What is the project when craft is not only fashionable like it is today, but is increasingly recognized as lying at the discursive center of art, design, and industry, both past and present? And my answer, again a personal one, but which I offer as a suggestion for more general use, is to say goodbye. I thought about this a lot, and I've decided that this is the last public talk that I'm going to be giving about craft, at least for a while. And The Invention of Craft, which I mentioned earlier, will also be the last book I will write on craft in the title, again, at least for a while. Now, I'm not going cold turkey entirely, so I'll still be editing the journal of Modern Craft, for example, and I'm still, of course, working with students and colleagues, many of whom are great friends of mine. And I guess I should say I'll also still follow the scene, if there is a scene anymore. But I think that for me it's time to talk about something else. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of them are entirely personal, like being afraid of repeating myself, which I've started to catch myself doing on occasion. And also maybe being afraid of putting more words on the subject out into the world than people really want to read. 3 books with craft in the title in 4 or 5 years seems like a lot. But one thing I want to stress in this goodbye is that it's not in any sense, at least I hope it's not in any sense, a replay of the other departures that have shaped craft history until now. In such instances, saying goodbye to craft is meant to serve as a launching pad into a supposedly more artistically valid endeavor. Interestingly, Julia used the launching pad motif earlier. But I'm not sure that it doesn't simply remap the territory and stay within it. And that is certainly not the kind of farewell I have in mind, nor do I want to emulate an earlier set of departures, which I describe in my next book, in Invention of Craft, which focuses mainly on the late 18th and early 19th centuries, although with a lot of material about the present day as well. And in that period, the apologists or supporters of the factory system issued their own goodbye to craft, and also, again, good riddance, rejecting artisanal knowledge as backward, inefficient, a precursor only to more systematic, automated, and effective ways of doing things, in which workers could be treated like just another moving part. This set up a clear opposition between the hand and the machine. And this is, I think, very interesting, purely as a historical point. It was these pro-factory writers that set up the value system that we're familiar with today, the value system of people like Ruskin and Morris. Ruskin and Morris only turned it upside down later in the century, but it was invented long before they came on the scene. So the invention of craft by craft's opponents, not its supporters. For example, the physician, Andrew Ure, U-R-E, Andrew Ure, best remembered today for his 1835 book, Philosophy of Manufactures, which is in turn best remembered because Karl Marx in Capital used it as his major punching bag. And Marx made Ure into a kind of cutout cartoon villain of pro-factory rhetoric. But in fact, he was a much more complicated figure, and to many workers, in fact, a hero. He was involved with setting up one of the very first mechanics institutes up in Scotland, and taught generations of what they would have called mechanics, which is to say industrial artisans, in not only the practice of their work, but also the theory of their work. So he would, for example, teach them physics as a way of teaching them how to make machine tools. He also wrote long treatises describing the productive processes of his day in minute detail. But despite his interest in these workers, he could not have been more explicit in relegating what he called handcraft operations to the dustbin of history. So he described them, for example, as capricious and hardly susceptible of scientific investigation. And with that phrase, swept them aside and said, so I don't really need to tell you about them in my massive tome about how things are made. He's only interested in the new processes, not the old ones. And so accustomed are we to thinking of craft in this oppositional dialectical way between the traditional and the new, that it's perhaps easy to miss the novelty of what Ure was doing in drawing this distinction. Craft was being invented in texts like this one, as I said, being invented in the negative. It was created as the mirror image of industry, the mirror image of progress, and it didn't exist in the way that we use it today before that happened. This has powerful cultural and geopolitical implications too. So for example, nowhere was the invention of craft more clear-cut, or more brutal than in the British Empire's treatment of its colonies, especially India. So perversely, British commentators would look at a textile like this one, hand-embroidered, by the way, you can imagine that, or this carved cradle, as possible, these triumphs of regulated hand craftsmanship, possible only because of a deficit of humanity in their makers. According to this view, Indian craftsmen did not lack what they called mere mechanical facility. They were adept with their hands, but, this is quoting a period source, they lacked those faculties of the mind that conduced to the species of judgment called taste, with the result that in the best of Indian examples, the details will not bear looking at. There is an absence of glaring faults, but no one feature of beauty. And so what they were doing here is saying, effectively, the traditional Indian craftsman is just like a machine, is only a very, very inefficient machine. And you can do just as well with a machine much more cheaply and effectively. Through this imperialist lens, even what might seem to us today to be signs of flexibility and mastery could be presented instead as lamentable and primitive. For example, the artisan's dependence on a very limited number of very simple tools, they would have said crude tools, 2 or 3 tasks for a job that, as again a period writer said, with us 100 tools would be employed. The Indian craftsmen were using a couple. Also, their itinerant work habits were singled out by these commentators as being signs of a kind of poverty of means, because it meant that they weren't working with a well-equipped shop. So the fact that they could adapt to whatever circumstances they were in seemed to hold no value for them. And this is what I'm showing you here is a so-called company painting, which is made by an Indian artisan for an East India company, in other words, a mercantile patron and official. And as you can see, it shows this spinner, this woman spinning probably cotton thread, in an attitude of placid passivity, with only a few tools with her as she plies her trade. And for a British viewer of the time, early 19th century, such a scene could only be interpreted as a kind of lack of possibility, and the endemic malady of a culture immune to the instinct of self-improvement, a kind of animal-like state. My book title, The Invention of Craft, actually was inspired by this line in a difficult but wonderful and important book called The Bureaucracy of Beauty by Arindam Dutta, who's a professor at MIT. And he puts his finger on the far-reaching implications of this logic. As he said, if colonial officials hadn't found any good craftspeople in the colonies, they would have had to invent some, because in order to formulate their own idea of the West as powerful, progressive, and efficient, they had to have something to juxtapose it against. So here he's sort of updating Edward Said's inspiring work about Orientalism to the sphere of production. We might also think of the work of another theorist, Johannes Fabian, who has critiqued the modern discourse of anthropology for tacitly suggesting that there are different temporalities that apply in different cultures. In other words, we live in the present, they live in the past. And as he says, there's no knowledge of the other, which is not also a temporal, historical, and political act. So however this supposedly natural, traditional thing, craft, was assessed in 19th century accounts, the very supposition of its authenticity settled it firmly within the province of the other, displacing it both in space and time, either into the past or into an unchanging, mystically tinged, ever-present. And now I think you can see why it's so important for contemporary scholars to challenge the idea of authenticity. It goes right back to these highly prejudicial, asymmetrical colonialist projects. And so think about that next time you hear somebody say that craft is honest or true or authentic or indeed traditional. Now, to shift to a slightly other interesting problematic that comes out of the 19th century, if the 19th century account of craft presents it as a static ground, what that means in turn is that any craft that happens within industry must become invisible or inadmissible as craft, which means that you have a big missing storyline in the history of craft. Because of course artisans were not made obsolete by mass production, and I alluded to this a little earlier, but I'll say a bit more about it because I think it's a crucial point. With the rise of modern industry, skills did not disappear. In fact, they became more important than they ever had been before, because it was skilled hands that made the machine tools that would make the goods of Victorian culture. It was skilled hands that shaped the patterns or the molds for purposes of reproduction, skilled hands that kept the tools in running order once they were made, and in most cases it was actually skilled hands that finished the surfaces of every article, because machines weren't capable of achieving the quality required And a good example of this is the famous interchangeable parts of Eli Whitney, which is usually presented as the kind of great opening gun, if you forgive the term, of modern industrial mass production. In fact, every single one of those gun parts had to be finished by hand because they came off the machine very unclean. So all of that supposed transformative mass industry, that culture was made entirely possible by skilled craftspeople. So we tend to think of the 19th century as a great period of decline in craft, but in fact it was the opposite. There were undoubtedly more skilled workers in Britain in 1850 than there had been in 1750, precisely as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And also much more value was riding on their work economically. Not only factory engineers and mechanics, machine tool makers, but also shipwrights, bridge riveters, builders, carriage makers, on and on and on. What these hands lacked was clearly not skill, as anyone who has ever tried to rivet a bridge together will tell you, but rather autonomy, freedom. Hence the rise in the middle of the century of the organized labor movement, which upheld very clear distinctions between what they would have described as skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled occupations. And so what they did was to begin to formulate a political agenda based on that hierarchy. This was the ultimate nightmare for the factory apologists, men like Andrew Ure that I told you about earlier. The nightmare that workers would not willingly act their part in the great machine industry, but would instead apply friction to their churning wheels of progress. Now, these unions were by no means regressive. They were, in fact, the origin of our own left-wing political parties. And as you can see in this image, which is the emblem of, well, it's called the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, which sounds a bit boring, but it's actually the first mega union that was set up in Britain in 1851, weirdly, the very same year as the Crystal Palace, the Great Exhibition. And interestingly, the emblem was designed by an industrial iron worker named James Sharples, who was a self-taught engraver. And as you can see, I hope, the emblem presents these skilled workers within this well-ordered edifice, a harmonious palace of modern productivity, with shipping coming in on the right and a train coming in on the left. So the circulation of these goods is traveling, if you like, through the temple of skill. And the same artist, James Sharples, created this lovingly made depiction of a forge about the same time, probably very similar to the one where he worked. It shows a similarly orderly world of labor. It's a very unusual image in that it's a picture of a workplace by the person who actually worked in one, which is very, very hard to find from the 19th century. And it's probably quite accurate. He carefully renders the architecture of the space, as you can see, the world of the tools that it contains. You see them all hanging there on the wall to the right, and also the dress and bearing of the workers. It's a scene of professional interdependency in which labor is clearly divided into discrete tasks in a very modern way according to skill level: skilled, semi-skilled, unskilled. This hierarchy is spelled out in a progression from left to right. First, a younger figure, probably an apprentice who stokes the forge fire, face right into flames, low paid, probably dangerous, unskilled. Then the two foundry men with the pipe, doing the same thing over and over again, but difficult, requiring a lot of knowledge and judgment. And finally, the shop foreman, who directs the activity by pointing into the background and is clearly in charge. His long experience, but also his identity, is subtly indicated by the worn leather apron he wears. This is the skilled worker, and everything depends on him. So this image uses the tools of a visual narrative to convey the same themes as Sharples' emblem for the Amalgamated Society. All the workers are in their rightful place according to their skill. Now, these men certainly had no desire to say goodbye to craft. This was their livelihood, and they didn't see it, obviously, as being threatened by industry. Indeed, it had come into being because of industry, the possibilities of new materials like cast iron. But this brings me to another type of departure, which is the one issued by the arts and crafts movement. And in this case, we have not so much a gesture of goodbye as a plaintive narrative of loss, which is typically accompanied by a call for preservation or revival. William Morris and his colleagues, fired by the spirit of socialism, had no time for the organized labor movement and its accommodationist approach to capitalism. This is another story I don't really have time to tell you, about the separation of the politics of skill on the one hand from the symbolic use of craft and aesthetic register on the other. But again, it's one of the most important stories there is in the history of craft, and one that's scarcely told. The question being, effectively, you had a very organized labor movement, organized around skill, in fact, that was happening, growing precisely during Morris's time. Why did he hate it so much? Why did he not join common cause with them? He was a socialist. They were involved in left-wing politics. The basic answer is that he thought that they were too soft on capitalism, not willing to destroy it because they were profiting from it. But what that meant was that he was completely blind to all those industrial crafts. In other words, blind to 95% of the craft going on around him, despite the fact that he was the supposed champion of craft. So this divorce, or presumption of a departure, the disappearance, supposedly, of craft in Morris's time, rendered the arts and crafts movement no less problematic from my perspective than the factory apologists, the people like Henry Ure, or indeed the later statist consciousness of Fulkus. And again, I think it's really worth emphasizing the repetition over and over and over again of these departures. All the way back in 1829, Thomas Carlyle had written, quote, "On every hand the living artisan is driven from his workshop to make room for the speedier inanimate one. The shuttle drops in the fingers of the weaver and falls into iron fingers that ply it faster." And when you stop to think about it, it is truly amazing that every generation can tell itself the same thing, as if, in fact, the idea were a new one, that is this generation that is witnessing the disappearance of craft forever, and therefore has a unique responsibility to save it, rather as one might be obliged to save an endangered species of animal or indeed a little tree. A century after Carlyle lamented the loss of craft in his own time, in 1923, a man named George Sturt, who had grown up in a wheelwright shop, wrote about the craft of his father and grandfather and great-grandfather, which had remained intact, as he wrote, since the days of the Canterbury Tales, but seemed to be vanishing from the face of the earth. And of course, this is exactly the same story I got a century later on the show, Handmade Revolution. I shot a little piece with a wheelwright, and he said the same thing. Wheelwrights are disappearing from the face of the earth. And of course, there we were in a tourist site that was intended to demonstrate wheelwrighting to the next generation. Today, we have organizations like the Heritage Crafts Association, led by the charismatic lathe turner Robin Wood, also featured on the show, who devotes himself to preventing the loss of traditional craft skills and is haunted by the day in each trade when, as he says, the last craftsperson stops working. And he really is like a kind of 21st century collector of last craftspeople. So he finds a scissors maker in Sheffield or a basket maker in Devon, and then finds them and sort of promotes them exactly as you would the precious last example of a bird species. And this is the most powerful and paradoxical idea about craft that has come down to us from the 19th century. Craft was invented as an absence. It came into being as a figure of cancellation, an X marking a spot that had never existed in the first place. This image of craft as a memory that haunts the present is an inextricable aspect of its cultural power. Craft simultaneously gives shape to our desire for continuity and reminds us of the actual tragic continuity of our experience. So what I'm suggesting here is that although this story is fraudulent and false, it is also doing real cultural work. Because what it enables us to do is psychologically deal with the disruptions of modernity, because it stands for this thing that we feel we lack. It's very much like the Madeleine in Marcel Proust's novel Remembrance of Things Past. Or again, you could say it's something like a bandage that simultaneously heals a wound and also calls attention to the wound, whether or not there's a wound there at all. 200 years then, since craft was invented, in which it has constantly been shadowed by the sense of an ending. But obviously craft has not gone away as a result of these various departures. If craft was a modern invention, it has also drawn much of its power from the sense of urgency that is enacted through these various forms of farewell. But as I've made clear, these are not ways of saying goodbye to craft that I believe in. So, given that I want to say goodbye to craft, what sort of departure would fit our own times? What sort of goodbye can I offer from my own experience? Well, Andrew Ure thought craft was too slow and needed to be made efficient. William Morris thought craft was too fragile and needed protection. Peter Voulkos thought it was too parochial and needed to be left behind altogether. I feel the opposite. I feel I can say goodbye to craft after all these years of working on it because it is so strong, so fast-moving, so pervasive, so permanent, so multiple. The power of craft, the power of making, is all around us for all to see if we look in the right places. It doesn't need help. It's on reality television shows like Timber Sports, which pits woodsmen against one another in the fine arts of tree chopping. It was at the royal wedding in London in April 2011, in this dress designed for Sarah Burton, who took over as the head of the fashion house of Alexander McQueen after his tragic suicide. Kate Middleton, now Duchess of Cambridge, wore this gown which featured lacework made by the Royal School of Needlework. The lace was largely executed in what's called the carrot-across applique technique, so from Ireland, which, just as a little aside, was invented in the 19th century, not earlier, as precisely as a way to keep children from starving during the potato famine. So they found an old piece of lace, taught the skills to replicate it to all these children, and often that was the only way that families living in rural Ireland were able to stay alive. Now, to my knowledge, nobody on the BBC drew the connection between Kate Middleton's dress and these tragic historical circumstances. But the reference to Irish craft is certainly one aspect of a wedding outfit that was absolutely saturated in a multi-layered British past, with its Victorian corset, its understructure and bustle, its Cartier tiara dating from 1936, and of course, inevitably and overwhelmingly, its echo of another royal wedding 30 years earlier. In true Proustian manner, the dress functioned as the locus for a giant spectacle of national sentiment and celebration, but also tacitly, very rarely mentioned on the day, a healing, a marker of past sorrow, and almost the lifting of a curse. Anyone thinking that craft is threatened in the 21st century should consider this example, consider the fact that a dress this powerful, viewed and adored by millions, used to seal a wound that big, that imaginary, could only ever have been handmade. And in the face of such narratives, in fact, it does seem to me time to say goodbye to craft, at least in this sense. We need to stop worrying about it, and we also need to stop treating it as if it were a field or a constituency, a cause, a project, or a mission. Let's have the courage to say that craft will not disappear, that it is not an endangered species, that it is powerful. Yes, obviously, I know there are problems. It's not this simple. People don't learn skills by magic. They don't learn skills by downloading them from the internet. It is a problem that crafts courses are closing, that the word craft disappears. And that's not a positive thing, necessarily. There are positive reasons, for example, to move laterally across disciplines, which I think we all should agree with are good things, permissive things, things that open up new possibilities. The possibility that you could make something completely new and different every day that you walk into your studio if you only had the imagination. But obviously that raises serious questions about how you're going to do it. And so that's a key dynamic, key problematic of this new post-disciplinary realm. For my own part, I have a new project on the books which tries to acknowledge this sense of radical possibility, this open-endedness. It's an exhibition which, if all goes well, will open in these new galleries that we're building at the V&A around about late 2016. This is a digital rendering of this new space that we're trying to build underground in part of the museum. So the idea of the exhibition is to present the museum's collection in the future tense, as it were. And the show is called The Future, a History. It will begin with medieval images of the Last Judgment, so the exhibition starts with the end of the world, you might say. It continues through fabulous machines and automata envisioned in the Renaissance, the visionary architecture of the Enlightenment, which looks so weirdly like the cover of a science fiction book, on through Victorian imaginings of the future, flying cities or fashions of the future. This is a great one, an 1851 illustration of what clothing might look like in 1951. Obviously, the 20th century's romance with the future, the close relationship that films and literature had to contemporary design. So for example, these images from H.G. Wells's Things to Come, resembling very much things that were being made by industrial designers like Raymond Loewy at the time. And finally, the show will come to the present day and contemporary forecasts about the future through design and art in a time that when we seem to live in the future almost more than the present, constantly held as we are on the edge of calamity and possibility alike. Now clearly this is not a craft show, but it almost goes without saying that in navigating these waters of the future, past and present, I'll be relying on everything I have learned by studying craft's temporalities, especially its peculiar way of going forward by reverting to tradition. And one of the things I think is so interesting about the future is that it is recursive. In other words, it's shown the same again and again and again, so the future is itself a traditional thing. And of course, I'll also be specifically drawing on some of the utopian thinking from craft discourse itself. For example, Morris's News from Nowhere, which is probably the greatest futurist novel of the late 19th century. And in line with what I've been saying about seeing craft as a potent force for change, I'll be thinking about the fact that imaginings of the future are almost always handmade. So here, for example, you have a tool that replaces the hand as a drawing instrument, but of course the tool itself has to be handmade. So the hand disappears only to reassert itself with more force than ever. So from the fantastical inventions of the Renaissance to the prototypes and renderings of the present, projections of tomorrow are inherently impractical, and they require great skill to bring into being. Exactly the formula that has long defined modern craft. So you can see, even as I say goodbye to craft, I continue to see it as the foundation, the conceptual framework, and the connective tissue, a kind of reverberating echo in all my work. Similarly, I would say to anyone who cares deeply about craft and its associated virtues to keep caring just as much, but not by forming a lobby or a pressure group, not by cheerleading, not by feeling that you have a private cause to defend that you cherish and hold dear, but rather by carrying your skills and insights, whether in making or writing or curating, into new and uncharted waters. For in fact, when all is said and done, neither you nor I actually can say goodbye to craft definitively, even if we wanted to. We can't do without it. That's the whole point of it being there. We can't say goodbye to it on that deeper level any more than we can say goodbye to our own past, any more than we can say goodbye to our own childhoods. That is the big mistake so many have made. Architects thinking they can leave mere building behind. Self-appointed artists wanting to deny the physicality of their own creations. Even when craft isn't center stage, and it usually isn't, it's there nonetheless. It's there as a necessity, a means of making the future present. So even as I say goodbye, craft, for now, I do it in full knowledge that it will continue to be my constant companion. So thanks to you all for listening, and I wish you an early Merry Christmas.